The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of Redemption's only saloon, dust swirling in angry clouds around its wheels. Margaret Sullivan clutched the rough cotton cloth wrapped around the lower half of her face, her fingers white-knuckled against the fabric. Through the window, she watched townspeople gather, their whispers already starting like rattlesnakes warming in morning sun. She'd come 300 miles to answer an advertisement for a housekeeper. The letter had been clear: room, board, and $20 a month. It hadn't asked about her face. She hadn't told. Before you continue with Margaret's journey, I'd love to invite you to take a moment to subscribe to our channel and leave a like on this video. Your support truly matters and motivates us to bring you more quality stories like this one. I'm curious, where are you listening from today? Please let us know in the comments. That'll be $2, miss. The driver's voice carried no warmth. Margaret's remaining coins clinked in her palm, barely enough for the fare and nothing more. She descended carefully, her worn boots finding uncertain purchase on the step. The moment her feet touched Main Street, the murmurs grew louder. Lord have mercy, what's wrong with her face? Probably got the pox. We should send her right back. No decent woman hides her face like that. Margaret kept her eyes down, focusing on the wooden planks beneath her feet. Each comment was a familiar knife, twisted with practiced cruelty. She'd learned in St. Louis that beauty mattered more than character, that scars were moral failings to be mocked rather than wounds to be understood. The ranch office sat at the end of the street, its sign reading Thornton Cattle Company in faded letters. She pushed through the door, the bell overhead announcing her arrival. A weathered man behind the desk looked up, his eyes narrowing the instant he saw her cloth-covered face. "Help you? I'm here about the housekeeping position. Margaret Sullivan." We corresponded. His expression shifted from suspicion to something worse, pity mixed with disgust. "Miss Sullivan, yes. Well," he cleared his throat. "I'm afraid that position's been filled. The telegram said to arrive today. I came all this way." "Can't help what the telegram said. Position's filled." He turned back to his papers. Dismissal absolute. Margaret stood frozen, her last coin spent, her last hope crumbling. "Please, I'm an excellent cook. I can clean, mend, manage accounts. I worked for the Hendersons in St. Louis for 3 years, before." "Before what? Before whatever happened to your face?" He didn't look up. "This is a respectable operation, Miss Sullivan. Mr. Thornton's hosting potential investors next month. We need someone who can present well." The words shouldn't have hurt. They were the same ones she'd heard a dozen times before. But here, at the end of the line, with nowhere else to go, they cut deeper than the fire that had scarred her. She walked back into the harsh afternoon sun, the street still lined with gawkers. A group of ranch hands loitered outside the saloon, bottles in hand, their laughter growing louder as she passed. "Hey there, Scarecrow. Halloween ain't for 6 months. Bet she's hiding some real ugliness under there. Probably got bit by a rabid dog. Someone should put her down 'fore it spreads." Margaret walked faster, her vision blurring with tears she refused to shed. At the edge of town, she found a small church with a bench out front. She sank onto it, pulling her traveling bag close. The last of her money, 3 pennies, sat in her palm. She could trade her mother's silver locket. It was the only thing of value she owned, the only connection to a life before the fire, before the screams, before her fiancé had looked at her bandaged face and walked away without a word. A shadow fell across her lap. Margaret looked up to find a man standing before her, his hat in his hands. He was tall, built like someone who'd spent his life wrestling cattle and splitting wood, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of creek water in summer. Dust covered his shirt and chaps, and a day's worth of stubble shadowed his jaw. "Ma'am," he said simply. Margaret waited for the rest, the insult, the mockery, the inevitable request that she move along. Instead, he gestured to the bench. "Mind if I sit?" She shook her head, too tired to speak. He lowered himself beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. For a long moment, he said nothing, just stared out at the scrubland beyond the church, where sagebrush stretched toward mountains, purple with distance. "Heard what happened at the ranch office," he finally said. "Heard what those boys said outside the saloon, too." His jaw tightened. "Ain't right. It's nothing I haven't heard before. Don't make it right." He turned to face her, his gaze steady on her eyes rather than the cloth covering her face. "Name's Thomas Wade. I work at the Thornton Ranch. Been there 8 years, since I was 24. I run the West Pasture operation." Margaret Sullivan. She couldn't read his intention, couldn't understand why he'd approach her. "I should warn you, Mr. Wade, if you're here to add your own commentary, I'm here to offer you a job." The words hung in the air between them like something impossible. "The office turned me away." "The office don't run my operation. I do." Thomas leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his calloused hands clasped together. "I live in a line shack about 5 miles west of the main house. Just me and 2 other hands, Ben and Carlos. We work the herds out there, only come to town for supplies once a month. We need someone who can cook, keep the place from falling into complete chaos." "Why me?" "Because you need work and I need help. Seems simple enough." "You haven't seen my face. Don't need to." His voice held a quiet conviction that made her chest tighten. "I've seen your eyes. I've seen you hold your head up while folks said things that would make a grown man weep. That tells me more than any face could." Margaret's fingers trembled against her mother's locket. "I'm scarred, badly. The fire. We all got scars, Miss Sullivan. Some just show on the outside." He stood, offering his hand. $20 a month, room and board, same as the main house offered. Work's honest, and I give you my word you'll be treated with respect. Any man who doesn't answer to me, and I don't tolerate cruelty." She stared at his outstretched hand, rough and honest and free of judgment. In St. Louis, in every town she'd passed through, people had offered pity or revulsion. No one had offered dignity. "I need you to understand what you're accepting," she said quietly. "People will talk. They'll say you're desperate or strange or worse. Let them talk. I stopped caring what cowards think when I was 15. His hand remained steady. "Question is, can you cook?" Despite everything, a small laugh escaped her. "Yes, I can cook." "Can you tolerate 2 ranch hands who forget to wipe their boots and think beans constitute a vegetable?" "I've faced worse challenges." "Then we got ourselves an arrangement." His eyes crinkled at the corners. "My wagon's at the general store. We'll get you supplies, then head out before sunset. That work for you?" Margaret took his hand, his grip firm and warm and startlingly gentle. "Mr. Wade?" "Thomas. We ate formal out at the line shack." "Thomas." She stood, her legs unsteady. "Thank you. Thank me when you've tasted Ben's coffee. You'll understand why this is more rescue mission than charity." He settled his hat back on his head, then paused. "One more thing. At the shack, you don't need to wear that cloth unless you want to. It's just us out there, and we don't give about scars. But if it makes you feel safer, that's your choice. Your face, your decision." Something in Margaret's chest cracked open, a warmth she'd thought burned away forever, flickering back to life. The general store was blessedly empty when they arrived. Thomas moved through the aisles with efficient purpose, pulling flour, coffee, sugar, dried beans, salt pork, and canned goods. He added fabric for curtains, soap, and lamp oil without asking, piling everything on the counter. "Put it on the Thornton account," he told the shopkeeper, a thin man with nervous eyes that kept darting to Margaret. "That cloth-faced woman? Thomas, you can't be serious." "I'm dead serious, Ed, and you'll address Miss Sullivan with respect, or you'll find I'm shopping in Silverton from now on." Thomas's voice dropped to something dangerous. "We clear?" Ed swallowed. "Yes, sir, clear." Outside, Thomas loaded the supplies into a sturdy wagon, hitched to 2 draft horses. He helped Margaret up to the seat with the same careful respect, his hands steady on her elbow. As they rolled out of Redemption, Margaret watched the town shrink behind them, its cruel voices fading into distance. The land opened up before them, endless grass rippling like water, cottonwoods marking creek beds, and above it all, a sky so vast it made her chest ache. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Wait till you see it at sunset. Sky turns colors that don't have names." Thomas kept his eyes on the road, but something in his voice had softened. "I came out here after the war. Needed space, I guess. Needed something clean." "You fought?" 3 years with the cavalry. Saw things that," he shook his head. "Out here, the violence makes sense. Cattle, weather, the land. Nothing personal, nothing cruel. Just survival." Margaret understood that need for something clean, something honest. "The fire was 2 years ago, a kitchen accident at the home where I worked. I tried to save the family's youngest daughter. I did save her." Her hand touched the cloth at her face. "But the smoke, the flames. By the time they pulled me out." "You saved a child." "Yes." "Then every inch of those scars is a badge of honor, Miss Sullivan. Anyone who sees different is a fool." Tears burned behind her eyes, but she blinked them away. They rode in comfortable silence as the sun sank lower, painting the world in copper and gold. The line shack appeared as darkness gathered, a sturdy cabin nestled against a hillside, with a barn and corral nearby. Smoke drifted from the chimney, and 2 men stood outside, clearly waiting. "That's Ben and Carlos," Thomas said. "Fair warning, Ben talks too much, and Carlos don't talk enough, but they're good men." He helped her down from the wagon, then turned to his companions. "Boys, this is Miss Margaret Sullivan. She's our new housekeeper and cook. Anyone who treats her with anything less than complete respect will be eating their own teeth. We clear?" Ben, a lanky man with red hair and an easy smile, swept off his hat. "Ma'am, welcome. Just so you know, Thomas here's been burning everything he touches for 8 years, so we're already grateful." Carlos, shorter and broader with knowing dark eyes, nodded once. His gaze met Margaret's without flinching, without curiosity about the cloth she wore. "Dinner's beans again. You here just in time." They unloaded the wagon together, carrying supplies into a cabin that was cleaner than Margaret had expected, but clearly lacked a woman's touch. One large room served as kitchen and living area, with a sleeping loft above and 2 small bedrooms off to the sides. "You'll have the south room," Thomas said. "It's got the best light in the mornings, and the stove keeps it warm at night. We'll bunk in the loft and the other room." Margaret's room was simple but clean. A bed with a quilt, a washstand, and a window overlooking the eastern range. Someone had left wildflowers in a jar on the sill, their purple petals bright against the weathered wood. "Carlos picked those," Ben said from the doorway. "He won't admit it, but he's got a soft streak, wide as the Rio Grande. That night, Margaret cooked her first meal in her new home: salt pork with gravy, biscuits that rose light and golden, and beans seasoned with the wild onions Carlos had quietly provided. The men ate like they'd been starving, praising every bite with genuine enthusiasm. "Miss Sullivan," Ben said, sopping up gravy with his thawed biscuit, "I think I might cry. Real food, with flavor. Thomas, you should have hired her years ago. Worth hiring years ago." Thomas's eyes met Margaret's across the table. Sometimes things happen in their right time. After dinner, the men retreated to the porch for cigarettes, leaving Margaret alone in the kitchen. She stood at the window, watching stars pierce the darkness like silver nails in black velvet. The quiet wrapped around her like a blanket. No cruel voices, no mocking laughter, just wind and the distant sound of cattle settling for the night. Behind her, Thomas's voice came soft. "You all right, Miss Sullivan?" She turned to find him in the doorway, his face shadowed. "Margaret, please." He stepped into the room, but came no closer. "This must be strange for you. New place, 3 men you don't know." "Strange," she agreed, "but not frightening. You've all been—" She struggled for words. "Kind. I haven't experienced much kindness lately. World's got too much cruelty in it already without adding more." He shifted his weight, oddly uncertain for a man so confident on horseback. "I want you to know, if you ever feel unsafe here, for any reason, you say the word and I'll take you wherever you want to go. No questions, no judgment." Margaret studied him in the lamplight, this man who'd offered her dignity when the world offered only scorn. "I feel safer here than I have in 2 years, Thomas." Something passed between them, a recognition that neither could name, but both felt. Thomas cleared his throat, stepping back. "Well, good. That's good. I'll say good night then." "Good night." He paused at the door. "Margaret, tomorrow I'd like to teach you to ride. You're 5 miles from town, and you should know how to get there yourself if you need to." "I'd like that." After he left, Margaret finally unwound the cloth from her face. In the small mirror above the washstand, her scars stared back. Puckered skin stretching from her left cheekbone to her jaw, the tissue tight and discolored, pulling her mouth slightly to one side. The fire had stolen half her beauty, and all her prospects. Or so she'd thought. She touched the wildflowers Carlos had left, then climbed into bed between clean sheets that smelled of sage and sunshine. For the first time in months, she fell asleep without crying. The days that followed developed their own rhythm. The men worked the herds from sunrise to dark, returning for lunch and supper with stories of stubborn cattle and contrary weather. True to his word, Thomas taught her to ride. He chose a gentle mare named Daisy and spent patient hours showing Margaret how to sit, how to hold the reins, how to move with the horse rather than against it. "Easy now," he said, his hands steadying her waist as she mounted. "Let her feel you're not afraid. Horses know fear, and it makes them nervous." Margaret had removed her facecloth that first morning, watching his reaction carefully. Thomas's gaze had swept across her scars once, then returned to her eyes and stayed there. "You ready?" he asked. Just that. No pity, no revulsion, no awkward reassurances that the scars weren't that bad. Just a simple question about whether she was ready to learn. "I'm ready." They started slow, walking Daisy in circles around the corral while Thomas walked beside them, his voice steady with instruction and encouragement. By the end of the week, Margaret was cantering across the open range, wind tangling her hair and freedom singing in her veins. "You're a natural," Ben called as she raced past him. "Bet you could outride Thomas in a month." "Takes more than a month," Thomas replied. But his smile reached his eyes. He'd smiled more in the past week than in the previous year, Ben had confided. But she's got good instincts. The days were full of work, cooking, cleaning, mending the endless torn shirts and pants that ranch work produced. But the evenings held something different. After supper, they'd sit on the porch while Ben played harmonica and Carlos whittled, the music drifting across the darkening land. Thomas would sit beside Margaret, not touching, but close enough that she felt his presence like warmth from a fire. They'd talk about small things, the weather, the cattle, books they'd read. Sometimes they'd sit in comfortable silence, watching stars emerge. "Tell me about Before the Fire," Thomas said one night, his voice low beneath Ben's music. Margaret inhaled the cool air, gathering courage. "I was engaged. Robert. He was a clerk, respectable, kind enough. We were to marry that summer." She paused. "After the fire, he visited once. Looked at my face and said he couldn't. Said it wasn't fair to expect him to spend his life with someone damaged." Thomas's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "I understood, in a way. We'd chosen each other partly for appearance. He wanted a pretty wife for his pretty future. I wanted security, status. Neither of us wanted actual love." She turned to face him. "I think the fire saved me from a loveless marriage. Strange mercy, but mercy nonetheless." "Not strange at all." Thomas's voice was rough. "Sometimes the worst things that happen show us what's worth keeping." He was quiet for a moment. "I was engaged once too, before the war. Sarah. She was beautiful, laughed at all my jokes, made me feel like a king. What happened? War happened. I came back different, jumpy, couldn't sleep, kept seeing things that weren't there." He stared out at the darkness. She couldn't handle it. "Said I'd changed, that I wasn't the man she'd fallen in love with. Maybe she was right. Maybe war takes parts of you that don't grow back." Margaret reached out slowly, giving him time to pull away. When he didn't, she placed her hand over his scarred knuckles. "Some scars show on the outside, some don't. Doesn't make either less real." His hand turned beneath hers, fingers intertwining. His touch was gentle, reverent, as though she was something precious, rather than damaged. "You're not what people said in town," he murmured. "You're not something broken, or shameful, or to be mocked. You're—" he searched for words. "You're brave, and kind, and stronger than anyone I've ever met. And every morning when I wake up knowing you're here, this place feels less like exile and more like home." Margaret's breath caught. "Thomas!" A shout split the night. Ben's harmonica clattered to the porch floor as he jumped to his feet, staring toward the eastern range. "Fire," Carlos said, already moving. "Grass fire, coming fast." Thomas was on his feet instantly, his hands still gripping Margaret's. "Get the horses. Ben, ride to the main house, get help. Carlos, grab shovels and blankets. Margaret, I'm helping. It's dangerous. I've survived fire before." Her voice was steel. "I'm helping." There was no time to argue. They mounted and rode toward the growing orange glow on the horizon, the smell of smoke already thick in the air. The fire moved like a living thing, consuming the dry grass in hungry waves, driven by the evening wind. Thomas organized them quickly. "We dig a fire break here. Stop it before it reaches the canyon where the cattle are sheltering. Margaret, wet down the blankets and be ready to beat out spot fires." They worked through the night, digging desperately into the hard ground, swinging wet blankets at flames that leaped and danced. Smoke choked the air, burning Margaret's eyes and lungs, but she didn't stop, couldn't stop. The fire called up memories, flames licking up kitchen walls. A child screams, the smell of her own burning flesh. But she pushed through them, focusing on Thomas's voice calling instructions, on Carlos's steady presence beside her, on the task that needed doing. Hours blurred together. Her arms screamed with exhaustion. Blisters rose on her palms. But gradually, impossibly, the firebreak held. The flames reached the bare ground and died, starving for fuel. Dawn broke gray and smoky over the scorched land. Margaret sank to the ground, coughing, her face streaked with soot and ash. Thomas dropped beside her. His shirt burned in places, a nasty burn reddening his forearm. "You all right?" he asked. "Am I all right?" She grabbed his injured arm. "You're burned. We need to treat this." "It's nothing. It's not nothing." She pulled him toward the creek that ran near the line shack, its water cool and clear. "Sit," he obeyed, watching as she carefully cleaned the burn, her touch gentle despite her own exhaustion. The wound was angry and blistered, the kind that would pain him for days. "This needs proper bandaging," she said. Back at the cabin, Margaret, his good hand caught hers. "You could have been killed tonight. Why did you stay?" "Because it needed to be done. Because this is my home now too." She met his eyes. "Because you've shown me that scars don't define us. Our choices do. And I choose to stand with you." Something shifted in his gaze, warming it from Summer Creek to something hotter, deeper. His hand came up slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed a streak of ash from her unscarred cheek. Then, with infinite care, his fingers traced the ridged skin on the other side of her face. "You're beautiful," he whispered. Margaret's eyes burned, but not from smoke. "Thomas, you don't have to." "I'm not saying it because I have to. I'm saying it because it's true." His thumb traced the line where her scar met her mouth. "You're the strongest, bravest, most beautiful woman I've ever known. These scars just prove what I already saw, that you're someone who runs toward fire to save others, someone who stands when everyone else runs, someone worth—" His voice cracked. "Someone worth everything." She couldn't speak past the tightness in her throat. Instead, she leaned forward, pressing her forehead to his. They stayed that way as the sun rose fully, painting the scorched world in shades of gold. Two scarred people finding home in each other's broken pieces. Ben and Carlos found them like that an hour later, covered in soot and ash, holding each other like survivors of a shipwreck, clinging to the same piece of driftwood. "Well," Ben said, his voice suspiciously thick, "guess we should start building a bigger cabin. This one ain't suitable for a married couple." Thomas pulled back, his eyes never leaving Margaret's. "That's jumping ahead some. Haven't even asked her to dinner yet." "Then I'm asking you to dinner," Margaret said. "Tomorrow night. Just us. I'll cook something special." "I'd like that. I'd like that a lot." They returned to the line shack as a group, exhausted but alive. Margaret cleaned and bandaged Thomas's burn properly, then tended to everyone's smaller injuries while they told her she should rest. She'd fought as hard as any of them. "Rest later," she said firmly. "Doctoring now." That evening, Thomas knocked on her door, freshly washed and nervous as a schoolboy. "Margaret, you decent?" "Come in." He found her standing by the window, her face bare in the lamplight, her hair loose around her shoulders. She wore her best dress, simple but clean, and she tucked one of Carlos's wildflowers behind her ear. "You look—" Thomas swallowed hard. "I don't have words for how you look." She'd prepared roast chicken with herbs, fresh bread, and a dried apple pie that filled the cabin with cinnamon sweetness. They ate at the small table, alone for the first time since she'd arrived, Ben and Carlos having conveniently decided to check the north fence line despite the late hour. "They're not subtle," Margaret said. "Never have been." Thomas set down his fork, his eyes serious. "Margaret, I need to tell you something. That first day, when I saw you on that bench, offering up your last valuable possession just for a chance at work, I knew." "Knew what?" "That you were someone rare, someone worth knowing." He reached across the table, his bandaged hand palm up in invitation. "I've spent 8 years out here avoiding people, avoiding feeling anything, because it hurt too much. And then you showed up, covered in cloth, and carrying more courage than anyone I've ever met. And suddenly, avoiding feelings wasn't an option anymore." Margaret placed her hand in his. "I was so afraid," she admitted. "Afraid to hope that someone might see past these scars. Afraid that I'd never find anywhere I belonged. You belong here." His grip tightened. "With me, with us. You've brought life back to this place. Made it feel like more than just somewhere to hide from the world." "I'm not hiding anymore," she said softly. "For the first time since the fire, I'm not hiding." Thomas stood, drawing her up with him. They moved to the porch, where stars blazed overhead in their millions. The scorched land stretched dark around them, but already Margaret could see hints of green. New growth pushing through the ash. Life returning even in the wake of destruction. "Dance with me," Thomas said. "There's no music. We'll make our own." He pulled her close, one hand at her waist, the other cradling her scarred cheek. They swayed to a rhythm only they could hear, moving slowly under the vast western sky. "I'm falling in love with you," he murmured against her hair. "Probably been falling since the moment you climbed into my wagon and watched the sunset like it was the first beautiful thing you'd seen in years. I know it's fast. I know we've barely known each other a month, but out here, life's too short for slow." Margaret pulled back to see his face. "I'm falling too. Maybe already fell. You showed me that damaged things can still be valuable, that scars are just proof we survived." She smiled. "You gave me my life back, Thomas Wade. You gave me mine first." He leaned down, pausing just before his lips met hers. "Tell me if I should stop. Tell me to go slow if it hurts." "I'll die before I hurt you," she whispered, then closed the distance between them. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, two wounded people learning how to be tender again. Then it deepened, becoming something fierce and claiming and absolutely right. Thomas's arms tightened around her, and Margaret pressed closer, her hands fisting in his shirt, holding on to him like he was the only solid thing in a spinning world. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me. That's very fast. You got somewhere else to be?" Margaret laughed, the sound free and genuine. "I suppose I don't. But are you sure? People will talk. They'll say terrible things about you for choosing someone like me." "Let them talk." His voice was fierce. "You're not someone like you. You're Margaret Sullivan, who saved a child from burning, who fought a grass fire all night without complaint, who makes Ben cry over biscuits, and got Carlos to actually smile twice last week. You're the woman I want to wake up next to every morning and fall asleep holding every night. You're mine, if you'll have me. I'm yours, she whispered. And you're mine, together. Together, he agreed. They were married 3 weeks later by the circuit preacher who came through redemption. The ceremony took place on the front porch of the line shack, with Ben and Carlos as witnesses and the entire western sky as their cathedral. Margaret wore her best dress and no cloth over her face. The preacher's eyes had widened at her scars, but one look from Thomas had smoothed his expression into professional neutrality. Do you, Thomas Wade, take this woman? I do. Thomas didn't wait for the rest of the question. I take her completely, scars and strength and everything she is. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. And I take you, Thomas Wade, your scars and your strength and everything you are. Well then, the preacher said, flustered, I suppose you may kiss your bride. Thomas cupped her face in both hands, his thumbs gentle on her scarred skin, and kissed her like she was the answer to every prayer he'd never dared to pray. Ben whooped. Carlos smiled, his third smile since Margaret had arrived, and somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed their approval. That night, in the cabin they now truly shared, Thomas undressed his wife with reverent hands. Each piece of clothing revealed more scars, not just from the fire, but from a lifetime of surviving in a world that valued beauty over substance. You're perfect, he whispered, tracing the ridged skin down her shoulder. Every part of you is perfect. I'm scarred. So am I. He took her hand, placing it over the thick scar that crossed his chest, a cavalry saber wound from a battle he'd barely survived. We match. Margaret ran her fingers over his scars, then guided his hands to her waist. Go slow, she whispered. I'm nervous. I'll die before I hurt you, he promised, echoing her words from weeks ago. We go at your pace. We stop whenever you want. This is ours, together. And so they learned each other slowly, tenderly. Two scarred people discovering that broken pieces could fit together into something whole. Thomas worshipped every inch of her skin, scarred and unscarred alike, with his hands and mouth, and whispered words of devotion. Margaret let herself be vulnerable, let herself be seen and touched and loved without shame for the first time since the fire. When they finally came together, it was with a rightness that made Margaret weep. Thomas held her through it, his own face wet with tears, their bodies finding a rhythm as old as the land around them. I love you, she gasped against his neck. I love you so much. I love you. His voice was wrecked. My brave, beautiful wife. Afterwards, they lay tangled together in the lamplight, sweat-damp and satisfied and absolutely at peace. Thomas's fingers traced lazy patterns on her hip, while Margaret mapped the scars on his chest. Do you ever regret it? She asked quietly, taking in the scarred woman everyone mocked. Thomas shifted, rolling her beneath him so he could see her face. I regret every second it took me to get to that church bench. I regret every moment you suffered before I found you. He kissed the scarred corner of her mouth. But regret choosing you? Not for one heartbeat. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Margaret Wade. She pulled him down for another kiss, this one slow and deep and full of promise. I'm glad I was desperate enough to come to redemption. Glad I was brave enough to take your hand. Gold isn't what we need here, Thomas murmured against her lips. You are. You're all I need. Margaret recognized the echo of his first words to her, the moment he'd rejected her mother's locket and offered her something far more valuable: dignity, respect, and the chance to be seen for who she truly was, rather than what she looked like. The years that followed were full of work and weather, triumph and hardship. They built a bigger cabin on the hillside, with glass windows that caught the sunrise and a porch that wrapped around three sides. Ben and Carlos stayed on, becoming family more than employees. Margaret's reputation grew throughout the territory, not as the scarred woman to be pitied, but as the fierce ranch wife who'd fought a grass fire all night and could outride most of the men in the valley. She became known for her healing skills, riding to neighboring ranches when illness struck, never hiding her scars, never apologizing for taking up space in a world that had tried to make her invisible. 3 children came, 2 boys and a girl, each one taught from birth that scars were nothing to fear or mock. They grew up knowing their mother was beautiful because their father said so every single day, and because beauty had nothing to do with unmarked skin and everything to do with courage, kindness, and strength. Sometimes, in the evening, Margaret would stand on their porch and watch the sunset paint the world in impossible colors. Thomas would come up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, and she'd lean back into his warmth. "Still beautiful," he'd murmur. "Every damn sunset. The sky or me? Both. Always both." The town of Redemption eventually stopped talking about the scarred woman and the ranch hand who'd accepted her. New scandals came and went. But sometimes, young women would appear at the ranch. Girls fleeing bad situations, women with their own scars visible or hidden, and Margaret would welcome them in, find them work, show them that the world was wider than cruel voices and narrow minds. "You did this for me?" she told Thomas one night, watching the latest arrival settle into the guest room. "Showed me I was worth more than what the mirror reflected. I want to do that for others." "You're remarkable," he said simply. "You take pain and turn it into purpose. That's a rare gift." I learned from the best. 20 years after that first meeting on the church bench, Margaret stood in the same spot, now worn smooth by countless Sunday services. She was 52, her dark hair threaded with silver, her scars faded to pale lines that she no longer noticed most days. Thomas stood beside her, his own hair gone gray, his hands gnarled with arthritis, but still strong when they held hers. They were waiting for their daughter Emma's wedding to start, watching as guests filed into the church. "Nervous?" Thomas asked. "Not for her. She chose well." Margaret squeezed his hand. "I was just remembering the last time I sat on that bench. How desperate I was. How certain I was that my life was over. Instead, it was just beginning. Because of you. Because you saw me when everyone else looked away." Thomas turned to face her fully, his creek-water eyes still sharp and seeing. "I saw what was always there, Margaret. I saw a woman worth saving. I see a person worth everything." The echo of his words from 2 decades ago made her smile. "And I see the man who gave me my life back, who taught me that together we're stronger than either of us could be alone." "Together," he agreed, kissing her softly. The church bell rang, calling them inside for their daughter's celebration. As they walked up the steps, Margaret removed her gloves out of habit. She no longer wore cloth over her face, hadn't for 15 years, and caught sight of a young woman sitting alone at the back of the church. The girl's face was hidden behind a heavy veil, her shoulders hunched in that familiar posture of someone trying to take up as little space as possible. Burn scars were visible on her hands. Margaret and Thomas exchanged a glance. He nodded. After the wedding, they'd talk to her. Offer her work if she needed it. Show her that scars were just the beginning of the story, not the end. Because that's what you did when someone had given you everything. You passed it forward. You found others, standing where you once stood, and you offered them a hand, steady and warm and free of judgment. You showed them that the world held more than cruelty, that damaged things could be precious, that love was something you earned through character, not appearance. And you taught them the most important lesson of all, that together, two scarred people could build something beautiful. The winter that followed their wedding tested everything Margaret had learned about survival. November brought snow that piled 3 feet deep around the line shack, trapping them for weeks with supplies running dangerously low. The cattle huddled in the canyons, vulnerable to wolves and the killing cold. "We need to move half the herd to the lower pastures," Thomas said one morning, staring out at the white wasteland. "But the pass is snowed in. Won't clear for another month at least." Margaret stood beside him, wrapped in the heavy wool coat he'd bought her. In the 4 months since their wedding, she'd learned to read his silences, to see the worry he tried to hide. "There's another way. Carlos mentioned an old mining trail that cuts through the eastern ridge. That trail's dangerous, even in good weather. In snow." Thomas shook his head. "I can't risk it." "You can't risk losing half the herd either. The Thornton Ranch depends on those cattle." Ben looked up from where he was mending tack by the fire. "She's right, Thomas. And the mining trail's our only shot. Question is, who goes?" "I go," Thomas said immediately. "Then I'm going with you," Margaret said. "Absolutely not. It's too dangerous." Margaret crossed her arms. "I can ride as well as any of you now. I can shoot. I know basic doctoring if someone gets hurt. You need me. What I need is for you to be safe." Thomas's voice was tight with barely controlled fear. "Margaret, if something happened to you? And if something happens to you while I sit here safe and comfortable? How do I live with that?" She moved closer, placing her hand on his chest. "We're partners, Thomas. That means we face danger together." The argument continued for an hour, but Margaret was immovable. Finally, Thomas relented with conditions. She'd stay in the middle of the group. She'd follow orders without question, and at the first sign of real danger, she'd turn back. They set out at dawn 3 days later. Thomas, Margaret, Carlos, and 4 ranch hands from the main house. Behind them, 60 head of cattle moved reluctantly through the deep snow. The mining trail was barely visible, a narrow cut through towering pines heavy with white. The first day passed without incident. They made camp in a sheltered valley, building large fires to keep the cattle from straying. Margaret cooked salt pork and beans, while the men took turns standing watch. "You holding up?" Thomas asked quietly as they lay together in their shared bedroll, the stars brilliant overhead. "Better than you expected?" "I never doubted you could do it. I doubted whether I could handle watching you in danger." His arm tightened around her. "Loving you means being terrified half the time." "I know. I feel the same." She kissed his jaw. "But I'd rather be terrified with you than safe without you." The second day brought the first real test. They were halfway up a steep switchback when the lead steer balked, refusing to climb further. The animals behind bunched up, growing agitated. "They smell something," Carlos said, his eyes scanning the tree line. A howl split the cold air. Then another. Wolves, and close. "Circle the herd," Thomas shouted. "Keep them moving. If they stampede on this trail, we lose everything." The wolves appeared like gray ghosts between the trees, their eyes reflecting the weak winter sun. 6, maybe 7 of them, lean and desperate with hunger. They circled the herd, looking for weakness. Margaret pulled her rifle from its scabbard, her hands steady despite her racing heart. She'd practiced shooting every evening since arriving at the ranch, and Thomas had pronounced her a better shot than Ben. The wolves rushed in a coordinated attack. Margaret fired, and a wolf yelped and fell. She reloaded, fired again. Beside her, the men were shooting too, the reports echoing off the canyon walls. But one wolf got through. It leaped at a calf near the rear of the herd, jaws snapping. Without thinking, Margaret spurred Daisy forward, putting herself between the predator and its prey. She fired point blank, and the wolf dropped dead at her horse's feet. "Margaret!" Thomas's voice was ragged with fear and fury. "What the hell were you thinking?" "I was thinking about saving the calf." She reloaded calmly, though her hands were shaking now. "Did we lose any?" "No, we—" Thomas stopped, his anger draining away. He rode close, grabbing her face in both hands. "You could have been killed, but I wasn't, and neither was the calf." She leaned into his touch. "I'm all right, Thomas. I promise." He pulled her forward, kissing her hard and desperate. "Don't ever scare me like that again." "Can't promise that, but I promise I'll always come back to you." The rest of the climb passed without incident. They reached the lower pastures as sunset painted the snow gold and pink. The cattle spread out gratefully, finding grass beneath the thinner snow cover. That night, in a line shack even smaller than their own, Thomas made love to his wife with an urgency born of almost loss. Margaret welcomed it, matching his intensity with her own, their bodies saying what words couldn't. "I'm here, I'm alive, I'm yours." Afterward, as they lay tangled together, Thomas traced the scars on her face with infinite gentleness. "When I saw that wolf coming at you, I understood something. These scars don't make you fragile. They make you fearless, because you've already survived the worst and came out stronger." "We survived," she corrected. "Together." "Together," he agreed. Spring brought its own challenges. The snowmelt swelled the creeks into raging torrents, cutting off the line shack from the main ranch. Supplies dwindled. Margaret stretched meals thin, making flour and beans last longer than seemed possible. Then Carlos fell ill. It started as a cough, nothing serious, but within 2 days, he was burning with fever, his lungs crackling with every painful breath. Pneumonia, Margaret recognized with cold dread. Out here, 5 miles from town and cut off by floodwater, pneumonia was a death sentence. "We need the doctor," Ben said, his usually cheerful face gray with worry. "Creek's too high to cross," Thomas said. "Won't be passable for at least a week." Margaret knelt beside Carlos's bunk, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead. His dark eyes were glazed with fever, his breathing labored. She'd nursed the Henderson children through fevers before, had learned basic doctoring from their family physician, but this was beyond her limited knowledge. "Unless, my mother's medical journal," she said suddenly. "It's in my trunk. She was a nurse during the war. She wrote down every treatment she learned." She found the leather-bound book buried beneath her winter clothes, its pages yellowed but still legible. She flipped through desperately until she found the section on lung ailments. "Mustard plaster for the chest," she read aloud. "Steam inhalations with pine oil. Willow bark tea for fever." And she squinted at her mother's cramped handwriting. "Whiskey mixed with honey and lemon if available, given every 4 hours." "We've got whiskey," Ben offered. "And honey. No lemons, though." "We'll make do." Margaret stood, organizing supplies with brisk efficiency. Thomas, I need you to ride to the main house. Tell them we need pine oil, willow bark if they have it, and any citrus fruit they can spare. If the creek's too high, throw the supplies across. I'll watch for them. I'm not leaving you alone. Ben's here, and Carlos needs those supplies or he'll die. Her voice was firm. Go. Ride fast. Thomas went, but not before kissing her hard enough to bruise. I'll be back before nightfall. Keep him alive, Margaret. I will. She worked through the day with fierce concentration, applying mustard plasters that made Carlos cry out in pain, holding his head while he inhaled steam from a pot of boiling water, spooning medicine down his throat every 4 hours, exactly. Ben helped, following her orders without question. By evening, Thomas returned with supplies wrapped in oilcloth. He'd crossed the creek on horseback, the water chest-high and raging. He was soaked and shivering, but he'd brought everything she'd asked for. Margaret added pine oil to the steam, brewed willow bark tea, made the whiskey-honey mixture with the precious lemon Thomas had acquired from the cook's private store. Through the night, she tended Carlos, while Thomas dried off and warmed by the fire. You should rest, he said as midnight came and went. In an hour, his breathing still too labored. 3 days and nights, Margaret barely slept, catnapping in a chair beside Carlos's bed, while Ben and Thomas took turns helping. Slowly, impossibly, the fever broke. Carlos's breathing eased. Color returned to his face. On the 4th morning, he opened his eyes and croaked. Water? Margaret burst into tears. Thomas gathered her into his arms, while Ben whooped, and Carlos looked around in weak confusion. You saved my life, Carlos said later, when he was strong enough to sit up. I should have died. You didn't die because I didn't let you. Margaret squeezed his hand. Your family, Carlos. We don't lose family. After that, Carlos's loyalty to Margaret became legendary. He'd defend her against any slight, work himself to exhaustion if she needed help, and his rare smiles came more frequently in her presence. You've got a devoted shadow, Thomas teased one evening. I've got 3 devoted shadows, Margaret corrected, looking at Ben, Carlos, and Thomas with equal affection, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Summer brought unexpected visitors. Margaret was in the garden she'd planted behind the cabin, coaxing tomatoes and beans from the stubborn soil, when she heard horses approaching. 3 riders appeared, well-dressed men on expensive horses, clearly not locals. The one in front had pale eyes and a cruel mouth that made Margaret's skin crawl. Afternoon, Thomas said, appearing from the barn. His voice was carefully neutral. Help you, gentlemen? Looking for the Thornton Ranch House. Got lost on these damned back trails. The leader's eyes swept over the modest cabin, then landed on Margaret. His gaze lingered on her face, taking in her scars with obvious disgust. This is a ranch operation? Looks more like squatters. This is the West Pasture Line Shack. Main house is 5 miles east. Thomas moved subtly, placing himself between Margaret and the strangers. You'll want to follow the creek trail. We'll rest here first. Water our horses. It wasn't a request. The 3 men dismounted, making themselves comfortable on the porch like they owned the place. Margaret recognized the type. Men who'd never been told no, who took what they wanted because no one had ever stopped them. I'll get water, she said quietly, heading for the well. That your wife? The leader asked Thomas, loud enough for Margaret to hear. Shame about her face. Must be hard, looking at that every day. Thomas's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. My wife is the finest woman in this territory. Watch your mouth. Touchy, the man laughed. Just making conversation. Though I'd think a man like you could do better. Unless she came cheap? Thomas moved so fast, Margaret barely saw it. One moment, he was standing relaxed. The next, his fist connected with the stranger's jaw, sending him sprawling in the dust. The other two men reached for their guns. Ben and Carlos appeared from the barn, rifles already aimed. "I wouldn't," Carlos said flatly. The leader stood, wiping blood from his mouth. "You'll regret that, ranch hand. I'm Clayton Blackwell. My father owns half of Denver. He's investing in ranches out here, including this one, probably." "Don't care if your father owns the moon," Thomas said. "You disrespect my wife, you answer to me. Now get on your horse and get off my land." "Your land?" Blackwell laughed. "You're hired help. You don't own anything." "Maybe not, but I protect what's mine, and she's mine." Blackwell's eyes narrowed. "We'll see about that. When my father buys this ranch, and he will, first thing I'll do is fire you and every man loyal to you. Then we'll see how proud that scarred wife of yours is." They left in a cloud of dust and threats. Margaret came to stand beside Thomas, her hand finding his. "You didn't have to defend me," she said quietly. "Yes, I did. I'll always defend you." He turned to face her. "Margaret, if Blackwell's telling the truth, if his father buys the ranch from Thornton, we'll figure it out, together." But worry gnawed at her. The Thornton Ranch was struggling financially. She'd overheard Ben mentioning unpaid mortgages and desperate measures. If it sold, would the new owners keep Thomas and his crew, or would Blackwell make good on his threat? 3 weeks later, their fears materialized. A messenger arrived from the main house. Mr. Thornton wanted to see Thomas immediately. Thomas returned that evening, his face grim. "Ranch is sold. Blackwell Sr. bought it for his son to run. We've got 3 months to clear out." The words landed like stones in still water. Ben swore. Carlos's face went blank. Margaret felt her world tilting. "Where will we go?" she asked. "Don't know yet. Maybe find work at another ranch. Maybe." Thomas stopped, running his hand through his hair. "Hell, Margaret, I don't know. We've got a little savings, but not enough to buy land of our own." That night, they lay awake in the darkness, holding each other tightly. "I'm scared," Margaret admitted. "We just found home. I can't lose it." "You won't lose me. That's home, right? Wherever we are, as long as we're together." "Together," she agreed, but fear still coiled in her chest. The next morning, she made a decision. She rode to town alone, to the bank where she'd deposited the small inheritance her mother had left her. $200 she'd been saving for emergencies. This was an emergency. "I want to inquire about purchasing land," she told the bank manager. He looked at her scarred face with barely concealed distaste. "Land ownership requires a male relative or husband to co-sign, Mrs. Wade. My husband is Thomas Wade, ranch hand at the Thornton operation." A ranch hand. His tone made it clear what he thought of that. "Mrs. Wade, land costs money. Real money. Not the pittance a ranch hand earns." Margaret placed her bank book on his desk. "I have $200. How much land will that buy?" His eyebrows rose. He examined her book, then grudgingly checked his records. "There's a property about 8 miles north of here. 40 acres. Needs work. Owner died. No heirs. Bank's been trying to sell it for 6 months. It's rough land, rocky, not ideal for cattle." "How much?" $300. Margaret's heart sank. She was $100 short. However, the manager continued slowly. Banks desperate to unload it. Might take 200 if someone's fool enough to buy it. I'll take it. The manager stared at her. You understand what you're buying? It's barely habitable. The cabin's half collapsed. There's no well, no barn, nothing but rock and scrub. I understand. Draw up the papers. Your husband will need to sign. My inheritance, my name on the deed. Margaret's voice was steel. That's the condition. Otherwise, find another buyer. He grumbled, but he drew up the papers. Margaret signed her name carefully. Margaret Sullivan Wade, sole proprietor. When she returned to the line shack, Thomas was waiting on the porch, worried and angry. Where were you? You shouldn't ride alone. I bought us land. She handed him the deed. Thomas stared at the paper, his face cycling through shock, confusion, and something that might have been joy. Margaret, how did you? My mother's inheritance. I was saving it, and now seemed like the right time to spend it. She smiled nervously. I know I should have discussed it with you first, but I was afraid if I waited, the land would sell, or you'd insist we save the money for emergencies. He kissed her, deep and hard and full of gratitude. When he pulled back, his eyes were wet. You just gave us a future. We're giving each other a future. Together. Together, he agreed. The next 3 months were a blur of activity. They worked the Thornton Ranch during the day, then spent evenings and weekends at their new property, clearing brush, rebuilding the cabin, digging a well. Ben and Carlos came too, unwilling to be separated from the family they'd built. We can't pay you much, Thomas warned. Not at first. Don't need much, Ben said. Just need to stick together. Family doesn't abandon family, Carlos added. The cabin was small and rough, but they made it home. Margaret sewed curtains from flour sacks, planted a garden in the rocky soil, hung her mother's medical journal on a shelf Thomas built. Thomas and the men built a small barn, erected fences, and bought 6 cattle with the last of their money. The day they officially moved in, Margaret stood on the porch of their own cabin, on their own land, and felt something settle deep in her chest. Security, permanence, home. Worth it? Thomas asked, sliding his arms around her waist. Worth everything. They were dirt poor, exhausted from constant work, and facing an uncertain future. But they were together, and they were free, and they were home. That was worth more than gold. The first year on their own land tested everything they'd learned about survival and each other. Money ran dangerously low. The cattle struggled on the rocky terrain. Margaret's garden produced barely enough to feed them through winter, but they endured. Then, one spring morning, Margaret woke feeling strange. Her stomach churned, and the smell of coffee, usually her favorite, made her run outside to be sick. Thomas found her by the well, pale and shaking. What's wrong? Are you ill? Margaret looked up at him, realization dawning. Thomas, I think I'm pregnant. His face went through a dozen emotions in as many seconds. Shock, joy, fear, and settling finally on fierce protectiveness. You're sure? Not completely, but all the signs. She smiled, despite her nausea. We're going to have a baby. Thomas dropped to his knees in front of her, his hands gentle on her still flat stomach. A baby, he whispered. Our baby. Are you happy? Happy! He looked up, his eyes blazing. Margaret, you've given me everything. A home, a purpose, a reason to wake up grateful every damn morning. And now, a child? His voice cracked. I don't have words for what I feel. Margaret cupped his face, her thumb brushing away the tear that had escaped. Then we'll just have to show each other every day. The pregnancy was difficult. Margaret was sick most mornings, exhausted by afternoon. But she refused to stop working. There was too much to be done, and too few hands to do it. You should rest, Thomas said for the 100th time, finding her hauling water from the well. I'm pregnant, not dying. Women have been working through pregnancy since the dawn of time. Other women didn't fight grass fires and face down wolves. He took the buckets from her. Let me help. You're already working 20-hour days. Then I'll work 21. He kissed her forehead. You're growing our child, Margaret. That's work enough. But money worries kept Margaret up at night. They'd had to sell 2 of their 6 cattle to buy seed for planting. One more bad season, and they'd lose everything. Then opportunity arrived in an unexpected form. A wagon appeared one afternoon, carrying a well-dressed woman and her driver. The woman stepped down carefully, her fine clothes marking her as wealthy. "Mrs. Wade?" she asked. "Yes?" Margaret wiped her hands on her apron, suddenly conscious of her worn dress and work-roughened hands. "I'm Elizabeth Thornton. My late husband owned the ranch where your husband used to work." Margaret tensed. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Thornton, if you're here about the land sale. I'm here because I heard what you did for Carlos Mendez, how you saved his life when pneumonia should have killed him." Elizabeth's eyes were direct and intelligent. "My daughter is ill. The doctors say it's pneumonia, but nothing they've tried is working. I've heard you have medical knowledge, that you kept a man alive through sheer determination and skill." "I'm not a doctor, Mrs. Thornton. I just used my mother's journal." "My daughter is dying." Elizabeth's voice broke. "The doctors have given up." "You're my last hope. Please, I'll pay anything." Margaret looked at Thomas, saw the concern in his eyes, but also the trust. He'd support whatever decision she made. "Let me get my mother's journal and my supplies," Margaret said. "I can't promise anything, but I'll do whatever I can." She rode to the Thornton estate, now the Blackwell estate, and found herself face to face with Clayton Blackwell. His eyes widened when he recognized her, then narrowed with contempt. "You brought the scarred woman? Mother, are you insane?" "I brought the woman who saved Carlos Mendez's life," Elizabeth said firmly. "She's going to try to save Sarah." The girl was 8 years old, small and pale in her fever, her breathing labored and crackling. Margaret examined her carefully, checking her mother's journal, remembering everything she'd learned nursing Carlos. "It's pneumonia," she confirmed, "but complicated by fluid in the lungs. We need to drain it, help her breathe easier. It's risky, but do it," Elizabeth said immediately. Margaret worked through the night, using techniques her mother had described for battlefield injuries. She inserted a thin tube between the girl's ribs, draining the infected fluid carefully, while Elizabeth held her daughter's hand, and Clayton watched with barely concealed disgust. But it worked. By morning, Sarah was breathing easier, the deadly rattle fading from her lungs. Margaret continued treatments for 3 days, applying everything she'd learned, but adjusting based on the girl's responses. On the 4th day, Sarah opened her eyes and asked for water. Elizabeth wept. Even Clayton looked grudgingly impressed. "How much do I owe you?" Elizabeth asked. "Nothing. I was glad to help." "Nonsense." Elizabeth wrote a check and pressed it into Margaret's hand. "Please, you saved my daughter's life. This is the least I can do." Margaret looked at the amount and gasped. $300. Enough to buy more cattle, improve their land, survive for a year or more. Mrs. Thornton, this is too much. It's not nearly enough. Elizabeth squeezed her hand. Thank you, truly. As Margaret prepared to leave, Clayton stopped her. I misjudged you, he said stiffly. That doesn't mean I like you, but you saved my sister's life. I'll remember that. It wasn't an apology, but it was something. Margaret returned home with the check, finding Thomas waiting anxiously on the porch. How is she? She'll live. Margaret showed him the check. And we'll survive too. Together. Thomas pulled her close, his hand protective over her growing belly. You're remarkable. You know that? We're remarkable, she corrected. Together. Together, he agreed. Their daughter was born on a stormy November night, with wind howling around the cabin and rain drumming on the roof. The nearest doctor was miles away, the midwife unreachable in the flooding. Margaret labored through the night, with only Thomas, Ben, and Carlos to help. She'd studied her mother's journal on childbirth, memorizing every detail. But reading about pain and experiencing it were vastly different things. Go slow, she gasped between contractions. It hurts. God, it hurts. I know, love, I know. Thomas held her hand, his face pale with helplessness. You're doing so well, so strong. I'm not strong. I'm terrified. You're both. You can be both. He kissed her forehead. I'll die before I hurt you, Margaret. Just tell me what you need. Don't leave me. Never. I'm right here, always. The birth was long and difficult. Margaret screamed through contractions that seemed endless, pushed until she thought she'd tear apart, clung to Thomas like he was the only solid thing in a spinning world. And then, just as dawn broke gray and stormy, a baby's cry pierced the air. It's a girl, Thomas said, his voice choked with tears. Margaret, we have a daughter. He placed the tiny, squirming bundle on Margaret's chest. The baby had dark hair and creek-water eyes like her father, and lungs that announced her displeasure at being born into a cold, wet world. Hello, little one, Margaret whispered, exhausted and euphoric. Hello, my brave girl. They named her Sarah Rose. Sarah for the girl Margaret had saved, Rose for Thomas's grandmother. She was tiny and perfect and absolutely tyrannical, demanding attention every 2 hours and sleeping only when held. She's got your stubbornness, Thomas said one night, walking the floor with a crying Sarah while Margaret tried to rest. She's got your lungs, Margaret countered. That's definitely a Wade family cry. But despite the exhaustion, despite the fear of new parenthood, they were blissfully happy. Margaret would wake in the night to nurse Sarah and find Thomas watching them both with such love it made her chest ache. What? She'd ask. Just memorizing this. You, her, this moment, in case it's a dream and I wake up back in the war, back in the loneliness before you. It's not a dream. We're real. This is real. Thank God for that. Word of Margaret's medical skills spread throughout the territory. People began arriving at their door, ranch hands with injuries, women in difficult labor, children burning with fever. Margaret treated them all, charging only what people could afford, sometimes working for trade, a chicken, a sack of flour, an afternoon's labor on their land. You should charge more, Thomas said. Your skill is valuable. Money isn't everything. Sometimes kindness matters more. He pulled her close. You're going to save the whole territory, aren't you? Just doing what I can. What someone once did for me, seeing worth where others saw waste. By Sarah's first birthday, their small ranch had grown. They'd bought more cattle with Margaret's medical earnings. Ben had married a girl from town, building a small cabin on their land. Carlos had found contentment in solitude and hard work, his rare smiles coming frequently now, especially when Sarah grabbed his finger with her tiny fist. They'd built something real, something lasting. Not just a ranch, but a family. Not just survival, but a life worth living. One evening, as sunset painted their land in impossible colors, Thomas and Margaret stood on their porch with Sarah between them. The baby was learning to walk, taking unsteady steps from her father's hands to her mother's, giggling with each success. "You ever regret it?" Thomas asked. "Taking my hand that first day? Choosing this hard life?" Margaret looked at their cabin, their land, their daughter. She looked at Ben's house in the distance, at Carlos repairing fence in the fading light. She looked at the man beside her, scarred, strong, and completely hers. "Not for 1 second. You gave me something no one else ever did." "What's that?" "You saw me, the real me, under the scars and the fear. You saw a person worth saving." She smiled. "And then you loved that person so well, she learned to save herself." Thomas cupped her scarred face in his hands. "You're beautiful. Every day. You're more beautiful, not despite your scars, but because of everything they represent. Courage, survival, strength." "We survived," she corrected. "Together." "Together," he agreed, kissing her softly, while Sarah clapped her approval. They stood there as darkness fell, wrapped in each other and the life they'd built from nothing but stubborn hope and determined love. The world had tried to break them both, had marked them with scars visible and hidden. But scars were just proof you'd survived. And survival, Margaret had learned, was just the beginning. The real gift was finding someone who saw your scars and loved you fiercer because of them, who stood beside you through fire and flood and fear, who chose you every single day. That was worth more than unmarked skin. That was worth everything. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're enjoying this tale from. Are you listening at home, during your commute, or perhaps while working? Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. What did you think of Margaret and Thomas's journey? Your feedback means the world to us.